What would you do if you saw a young black woman carrying a tray of food at a restaurant, only for someone to point at her and say, "If you're so smart, then translate this"? Would you laugh with the crowd, look away and say nothing? Or would you ask yourself, why do we always demand that people prove their worth just because they're not wearing a suit, holding a diploma, or fitting the image we expect? This isn't just a story about a rude challenge. It's about a calm smile, a reply that left an entire restaurant speechless, and how one ordinary waitress forced a powerful system to relearn what it means to truly listen. Her name is Imani, and what she did that day wasn't fueled by anger, but by clarity, confidence, and trust in her own mind. A single moment, strong enough to redraw the line between prejudice and intelligence. There are people who don't walk into a room, they dominate it. Without saying a word or causing a stir, they simply appear the way the world has always bowed before them. Shoulders straight like a symbol of authority, footsteps with a rhythm like a warning signal, and eyes that don't rest on the person in front of them but pierce through, as if scanning outdated software in a world they've long since decoded. Graham Beckett was that kind of person. He didn't open the door to the Marigold House, he made it open. He greeted no one, looked at no one, walking in as if time itself had to pause to let him pass. A dark navy blazer perfectly pressed, a white shirt crisp enough to catch the sunlight, and his salt and pepper hair slicked neatly as if each strand understood that order was the top priority. The Marigold House was an upscale restaurant in downtown Savannah, where every tablecloth was steamed to erase even the faintest trace of rudeness, where balsamic vinegars were chosen by spoken introductions rather than labels, and where people like Graham came to be seen without needing to ask for it. The hostess followed behind him, her low heels tapping almost imperceptibly against the hand-laid tiles. "Welcome back, Mr. Beckett. It's an honor to have you," she said with a smile carefully trained to never dip in tone. But Graham had already veered left before she could finish. Table 8, a quiet corner, just enough light for someone to see him, but not enough for him to see anyone. Three people were waiting: a sleek ash blonde woman, a young man in a suit with no tie, and a tech executive glued to his phone like he hoped an email would save him from Graham's gaze. They all stood up as he approached, unprompted. Meanwhile, across the restaurant, Imani Rhodes stepped out of the kitchen. She carried a tray with 4 glasses of water, aligned with surgical precision. Dressed in a white shirt and a snugly tied apron, her braided hair tucked neatly into a low bun, without a strand out of place, Imani moved silently, not to avoid notice, but because she was used to being unseen. But she recognized Graham's footsteps, the way the tile trembled under expensive leather soles, the way the air thinned when he walked past like some invisible decree. Imani didn't look up. She continued delivering the water to table 3, placing each glass like a choreographed dance she had rehearsed for 2 years. But she knew she'd be assigned that table, and she was right. Back at the server station, Jorge, the restaurant manager, was checking the order system. Without turning, he said quietly, "Table 8, it's yours." Imani nodded gently. No sigh, no frown. She picked up the menus, checked the pen in her apron pocket, and walked off. Not too fast, not too slow, as if every step had been pre-programmed in a game whose rules she never wrote. Graham was already seated, elbow hooked over the chair, taking up nearly the entire bench like he wasn't sitting, but occupying. The young man looked around, tense. The woman flipped through the wine menu, her gaze sharp as a drafting pen tip. Imani approached, a practiced smile, her tone neutral but pleasant. "Good afternoon. My name is Imani. I'll be serving your table today. Still or sparkling water?" Graham didn't look up. "No gluten," he said, cutting in before anyone could answer. "And don't drizzle cheap vinegar on my greens. If I'm eating arugula, it better taste like arugula." Imani nodded, unbothered. "Of course, we use properly aged Modena vinegar, certified gluten-free. We also have tamari instead of soy sauce, completely wheat-free." This time he looked up slowly. His eyes scanned her like he was inspecting a misplaced design flaw. "You know what tamari is?" "Yes, I do," she replied without changing expression. Graham squinted. Then he turned to the woman. "Elodie, you order." Elodie spoke French, fast, clear, not searching for words. She mentioned Sancerre grapes, asked about the salmon source, and requested vegetables without butter. She didn't use a word of English. Imani replied in flawless French, so precise that even Jorge, from across the room, paused mid-task. She confirmed the salmon was wild-caught, assured her there were no dairy products, and suggested a light dessert. Elodie was surprised. She smiled, her expression shifting from skeptical to satisfied. As for Graham, he set his glass down, raised an eyebrow, and let a smug smile form on his lips. Well now, the waitress speaks French. The table fell silent. The young man looked up from his phone. Elodie tilted her head. Graham chuckled softly. Then, he said louder, as if inviting the nearby tables to listen, if you're so smart, translate this. He spat out a sentence in German, rapid, gruff, butchered as if he'd chewed through a dictionary moments earlier. The whole restaurant fell quiet, not because anyone was shocked, but because everyone was waiting to see what would happen. Imani didn't flinch. No frown, no retreat. She repeated the sentence, flawlessly, then corrected it using formal grammar, and finally translated it into English. The mind is like a parachute. It only works when it's open. No drama, no emphasis, just truth. And for the first time during that entire lunch, Graham Beckett had nothing to say. No one spoke after that. No compliments, no laughter, not a single word of admiration was uttered. But the change wasn't in sound. It was in the glances, in how fingers resting on the table suddenly froze, in the way Elodie stared at her wine glass in quiet reflection, and in the half-second delay Graham needed to pull back his own smile. He wasn't used to being corrected, especially not by a black woman in a simple white uniform, with no logo besides a small name tag, just legible enough to read, Imani. But she remained standing there, not bowing her head, not turning away, not rushing to step out from under the weighty shadow of power that many had learned to avoid from the very first sentence. Imani simply looked at Graham, not challengingly, not expectantly, just maintaining the space between them like an invisible fence built from knowledge. She wasn't attacking. She just wasn't retreating. Graham cleared his throat as if to laugh it off, but his voice betrayed him. The sound that came out was no longer the tone of a man in command of the table. It was more like the cough of someone trying to regain balance inside himself. You prepared that in advance, didn't you? He said, voice low and tight. Some memorized philosophy. Google Translate, maybe? Imani's face didn't change. I don't use Google Translate, she replied, her voice neither high nor low, steady and solid like wood grain. But I can explain it to you if you'd like. Graham folded his arms across his chest, an unmistakably defensive gesture. No need. But Elodie leaned in slightly toward Imani, her eyes curious and amused. I studied in Berlin, she said for the first time switching to English, still with the soft rhythm of a native French speaker. She's right. The way you used an informal pronoun for an abstract concept. I once heard a freshman say that trying to flirt with my roommate. It didn't work too well. The young man beside her bit his lip to suppress a laugh, but his shoulders gave him away, shaking with barely concealed delight. Graham stared at Elodie as if unsure of what she had just said. Then he turned back to Imani, attempting to regain control. So where did you study? The question sounded casual, but was, in truth, a trap, a standard test to see if the person in front of him had enough status to deserve continued attention. Imani didn't pause for a second. I majored in linguistics and international relations at UCLA. In my third summer, I joined an exchange program in Belgium. My roommate was German. I learned the language from her. My thesis was about intercultural communication between immigrant communities and local governments. From there, I began studying Mandarin to compare non-inflected grammar systems. But today, I'm your server. That last sentence was spoken as a statement, not an excuse, not with shame, not in self-deprecation. Just a truth, placed on the table like a clear glass of water. Take it or leave it. Graham looked at her, suspicion and fury warring in his gaze. He wasn't used to hearing someone in an apron speak about grammar systems like she belonged at a university podium, and even less used to that person doing so with a steady hand. He tried to smirk but found no angle in the story to twist into a joke. Elodie turned a page in the menu, her attention clearly shifted away from Graham, as though she'd found something far more interesting to focus on. The young man sitting beside Graham subtly shifted away, his eyes now fixed on Imani as though she were no longer a waitress, but the one holding the pulse of the entire room. Imani remained still. She didn't walk away. She didn't rush to take their orders. She waited, not because she feared missing something, but because she wanted to give them a choice, to proceed with respect or to pause and reflect. She didn't say that, but everyone heard it. Graham suddenly waved his hand, signaling for another server, but no one came. No one dared, because everyone had seen, and because the one person holding the rhythm of that table was the very person he had just dismissed. In the end, Graham leaned in, eyes on the menu, as if forcing himself to find a dish to prove he was still in control. "I'll take the cod," he muttered, voice noticeably quieter than before. Elodie set down her wineglass. "I'd like to try the beet tart. What do you think, Imani?" Imani offered a gentle smile. "The chef prepares it with white miso and almond flour. Not too bold, very delicate." Elodie nodded as if she had just consulted a culinary expert, not a waitress. The young man placed his order too, this time without even glancing at Graham. Once they were done, Imani gave a slight nod. "I'll send the order to the kitchen." She turned and walked away, posture as firm as when she arrived. But the shift wasn't only at the table. As Imani passed the bar, the bartender, Malik, raised his eyebrows at her as if to ask, "Did that really just happen?" but said nothing. Another server walking out of the kitchen gave her a quiet nod. At the Marigold House, whispers didn't need to be spoken. They were exchanged through glances, and everyone had seen. Manager Jorge still stood at the order station, hands behind his back, eyes on the reservation log, but his finger tapped the counter, slow, steady, as if calculating something that wasn't in the day's schedule. Imani stepped back into the kitchen. The head chef was resetting the prep station. "You okay?" he asked, eyes on his knife. "I'm okay," she replied. "Just a parachute that hadn't opened." He laughed, a short, dry chuckle. "I like that one." Imani said nothing more. She keyed in the orders on the POS terminal, her hands perfectly steady. But inside, something had shifted. Not anger, not triumph, but a very specific resolve. This time, she wouldn't let it slide like all the others. Not to prove a point, but to no longer allow others to define her by her uniform and a tray of water. And just like that, in a restaurant where everything was pressed flat and plated perfectly, a mirror had just been placed on the table. And the one staring into it was the man who thought he no longer needed to look. The atmosphere at table 8 after Imani walked away wasn't the kind of midday quiet usually found at the Marigold House. It wasn't the hush of executives skimming through emails while sipping white wine. It was a different kind of silence. The kind Elodie noticed first when her eyes instinctively scanned the room and caught a few other glances drifting in their direction. No one spoke, but clearly what had just happened had drawn attention from every corner of the restaurant. And at the center of that attention was Graham Beckett, the man who had just been corrected on his German grammar by a waitress in front of 3 associates. But what unsettled him wasn't the correction itself. It was the feeling that someone had just gently tugged aside the curtain covering his outdated way of thinking. Elodie said nothing further. She gave a small nod to the young man beside her, who, notably, hadn't touched his phone again, and placed her menu down like she had just concluded a meeting that needed no transcript. Graham remained seated, eyes fixed on his glass of water, index finger tapping the edge of the table in dry, offbeat rhythm. The German phrase, the one he wasn't even sure he'd pronounce correctly, still echoed in his mind, but now not as a challenge, more like an uninvited reminder. Behind the bar, Malik, the restaurant's bartender, was drying the 4th identical glass, but his eyes quietly followed Imani's path as she returned to the order station. One thing Malik had learned after 4 years in spaces like this was that whenever a guest's confidence was quietly broken by a server, the entire restaurant's rhythm would fall out of sync for at least the next 20 minutes. That disruption was invisible, inaudible, but if you listened closely enough, it was as real as a pin drop in a carpeted room. And today, that shift came from Imani's translated line, so precise it rendered every social defense meaningless. In the kitchen, head chef Dale was checking the stock for the afternoon shift when he saw Imani walk in. He looked at her, said nothing, just raised an eyebrow, a question that needed no words. She slipped the order ticket into the clip, slowly, as if each number had to fall into place, like a long equation. "You good?" Dale asked, voice as raspy as always. "I'm fine," Imani answered. "I don't need to prove anything, but I don't have to stay silent either." Dale didn't respond. He returned to his prep station, though his hands moved just a bit slower, as if he, too, was still thinking about that parachute she'd mentioned earlier. When she stepped back out, Malik was already pouring the next four waters for table 8. No need to ask. No need to check the order. Malik knew when the air at a table thickened like that. Water was the only thing that wouldn't make anyone uncomfortable. Imani took the tray, walking with a steady rhythm like the last working drum beat in a band that had lost its harmony. When she reached the table, she placed each glass down in silence. But it wasn't cold. She didn't try to restore the old atmosphere. She simply acknowledged that it had changed, and that she wasn't the one who needed to apologize for it. Graham looked up for the first time since the incident. He stared at her, not smiling, not scowling, just looking. "You studied in Germany?" he asked. Imani nodded. "I lived in Frankfurt for 6 months." He nodded slowly, then looked back at his water glass as if whatever he wanted to ask was hiding somewhere in the bottom. Then he looked up again, this time without the voice of command, but with the tone of someone stepping into a conversation they'd never been trained to have. "What were you doing there?" Imani set the tray aside, standing tall like a mirror without distortion. "I worked as an interpreter for an NGO, assisting refugees from Syria, Congo, and Iraq. I was the only American on the team, the only person of color, and the youngest." Graham said nothing. Neither did Elodie or the young man. Not because they didn't believe her, but because they didn't know how to ask a question that wouldn't shrink themselves in the process. "I've sat in meetings," Imani continued, "where every word I translated could determine whether a family got to stay or was deported. I've translated testimonies of mothers who didn't know if their children were alive. I've chosen words for kids who hadn't spoken since losing their parents. Phrases like, 'open your mind.' To me, they're not philosophical flourishes. They're survival conditions." Elodie tilted her head slightly, her voice softening. "I worked with the Red Cross in Geneva. I know what that feels like." Graham didn't look at Elodie. He kept looking at Imani, not with the eyes of someone evaluating, but with the eyes of someone being forced to reevaluate himself. "So why did you come back?" The question sounded ordinary, but it struck at a point Graham hadn't expected. Imani exhaled, as if she'd been waiting for that question all along. "My mother passed while I was overseas. My two younger siblings were still in school. One was in community college, the other in 11th grade. I came back because my family needed me." No one spoke. No one dared, because her answer left no room for pity or admiration. It was simply truth, clear, solid, and heavy, even without being touched. Imani looked straight at Graham. "Today I wear an apron, but I'm not asking anyone to define me by my job. I don't need you to think I'm brilliant to feel I deserve respect." Graham opened his mouth as if to speak, but then stopped. He looked toward Elodie, then out the window. The golden savanna light reflecting off the water glass made him squint slightly. Imani collected her tray and walked toward the kitchen without waiting for permission, because she hadn't asked to exist. And for the first time since Graham had entered that restaurant, he was no longer in control. He was simply someone trying to make sense of how he'd just lost, without anyone yelling, without anyone pointing, without anyone even standing. But he knew, and so did everyone else. In a room where even the sound of a knife brushing porcelain was calculated to avoid distraction, the only thing that could make an entire restaurant pause wasn't noise. It was the right silence, at the right time, by the right person. And at the Marigold House that day, the atmosphere had begun to shift. Not because someone yelled, slammed a table, or made a dramatic scene, but because Graham Beckett, a man used to never being interrupted, had just been forced into silence by a woman he assumed would simply bow her head and carry the tray past him. Elodie no longer looked at Graham. After Imani's final response, she seemed to shift her attention to her napkin, occasionally brushing it with her fingertips, as if weighing something far more serious than lunch. The young man sitting next to Graham, Andrew, had, at some unknown point, put his phone away in his breast pocket, his eyes still fixed toward the server station where Imani had just disappeared from view. But Malik, the bartender, still saw her. He watched quietly, not out of curiosity, but because he knew very well. Whenever the atmosphere changed course, the center was no longer the one speaking loudest, but the one who held stillness inside themselves. Graham took a deep breath, then placed his hand on the table, as if just to keep himself from slipping off the very chair he once dominated. He turned to Elodie, his voice lower now, stripped of its usual resonance. "What do you think?" The question seemed harmless, but in that context it carried a crack. Elodie tilted her head, as if carefully selecting words sharp enough to be honest, but not harsh enough to wound further. "I think you just witnessed something rare, invaluable." Graham nodded as though trying to grasp what she meant, but his gaze didn't linger on anyone. It flitted, like a child knowing they'd done something wrong, but too afraid to admit it. Andrew, who had remained mostly silent until now, suddenly spoke. "I have a cousin who worked as an interpreter for a humanitarian organization. She once told me there were sentences she translated that kept her awake for a week." Elodie looked up at him, her eyes softening. Graham said nothing. He didn't know how to continue. The conversation no longer belonged to him, and for the first time in years he felt like a passive figure in a discussion he'd always assumed he led. At that moment, Imani returned with a tray of water, carrying a small bread basket arranged with care like a miniature art piece. She didn't look at anyone for too long. She didn't need to. She knew exactly which eyes were following her and which were avoiding hers. She placed each glass of water silently, not lingering on anyone. And at the end she spoke gently, to no one in particular. "I hope you enjoy your meal." No one responded, not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't find words that would have felt appropriate. Graham opened his mouth as if to say something. Maybe thank you, maybe a forced joke to reset the tone. But he closed it again upon seeing Elodie back with her napkin, and Andrew reaching for his salad with the look of someone thinking about something far beyond greens and vinaigrette. Imani turned and walked away, back straight, neither slow nor rushed, and everyone, at table 8 and at other tables that had been quietly watching, understood that her departure wasn't that of a server finishing a task, but of someone who had just delivered a closing argument without needing a podium. At the server station, Jorge, the manager, was standing in front of the display showing available tables. But his eyes weren't on the screen. They were on table 8. He wasn't watching to intervene, but because he understood something most managers don't. Sometimes power doesn't lie in stepping in at the right time, but in knowing when to let silence do its job. Jorge had witnessed countless awkward moments in this restaurant, from drunk VIPs to celebrities nitpicking staff, but rarely had there been a moment where he didn't have to act and still felt justice unfolding on its own. A kitchen staffer emerged with a tray of food, passing Imani as she keyed in the next order. "What was that?" "Just now," he whispered. Imani replied with only one sentence. "Just another lunch shift." But she knew, and so did everyone else, that what had just happened was far from ordinary. It was a small, subtle shift, but enough to push the balance off-center for a man who thought he was the axis. By then, Graham no longer leaned back in his seat. He hunched slightly forward, arms folded, eyes looking out the window. Outside, Savannah's sky was still blue. The trees still swayed in the wind. But inside him was a different kind of silence, one he wasn't used to, because it didn't let him control anything. It forced him to listen. Elodie finally spoke, not to comment on the food, but to say something Graham probably needed to hear more than any apology. "You know, sometimes people don't need to prove they're right. They just need to stay quiet long enough for others to feel they're wrong." Andrew nodded, as if he'd just learned something no leadership seminar had ever taught him. Graham said nothing. He had no more words, and that silence was what truly turned the air. After Imani walked away once more, carrying with her the heaviness of silence and averted glances no one dared acknowledge, Graham remained seated, motionless. No longer the man who commanded the table like a general surveying his battlefield, but someone who had just been displaced from the center by silence itself. But there are people who do not know how to retreat, not because they're strong, but because they don't know how to lose. Graham Beckett was one of those people. He shifted slightly in his seat, adjusted a cufflink that wasn't out of place, then exhaled sharply as if rebooting a confidence system that had just glitched. Elodie remained silent. Andrew dabbed at his lips with a napkin, though he hadn't eaten anything. And Graham, by sheer instinct, began picking up the shards of his crumbling authority with the tools he knew best, cold tone and belittling words. When Imani returned with the bill and placed it on the table with a gesture so practiced it felt numb, Graham looked up, waiting for her to meet his eyes, but she didn't. She stood there, quiet as a mirror that reflected nothing but truth, and that composure was unbearable to him. He spoke loud enough for the table to hear, his voice low and deliberate. You know, the people who think they're smarter than they are, they're the ones who end up wearing aprons their whole lives. Imani didn't flinch. She didn't look around for backup. She simply tilted her head slightly, voice polite as if she hadn't just been insulted. I'm sorry, what did you say? Graham didn't smile. You heard me, he replied, leaning forward, fingers interlaced on the table like a professor beginning a lecture. Degrees are nice, but this is a restaurant, not a university seminar. People come here to be served, not schooled. Elodie looked up. Her gaze was no longer soft. It had sharpened into a direct cutting line. Andrew turned slightly, lips pressed together, as though what he'd just heard dried out his throat. But Imani, as always, did not retreat, did not bow her head, did not step back. She didn't need to prove her worth by raising her voice. She just needed to stand there. I serve with the respect I expect to receive, but carrying a tray doesn't mean I forget who I am. Graham laughed, but it was a hollow sound, dry, cracked. It broke apart the moment it began. Then who are you? The question landed like a final challenge, a last grasp at power before collapse. But he wasn't ready for the answer. Imani looked straight at him, clear, firm, without yielding. I'm someone who doesn't have the privilege of waiting for opportunity. I'm someone who had to graduate early to start working. Someone who learned 4 languages, not to brag, but to survive. Someone working 2 jobs while helping her younger brother apply for college. Someone who wakes up at 5, walks 20 minutes from the bus stop to make her shift, just to have enough to buy textbooks for the ones still in 11th grade. I'm the person you didn't expect would answer you back. And today I serve tables. But that doesn't make me any less valuable than anyone you've ever sat across from. The table went silent. There was no room left for mockery, no eyes left to avert. Only truth, lingering like condensation on glass, visible even without being wiped clean. Elodie touched her wine glass but didn't lift it. She was looking at Imani, not as a customer views a server, but like a student realizing there's more to learn than what they came for. Andrew bowed his head slightly, as if he'd just completed a silent crash course in the history of silence and the weight of bias. Graham said nothing. He bit his lower lip and turned his ring around his thumb. A habit from a time when he still believed everything was within his grasp. But this time, the ring didn't help him find his balance. Just then, Jorge, the restaurant manager, stepped out from the service area. He didn't speak. He didn't intervene. He didn't apologize. He just stood there, tall, composed, his eyes still and sharp like a lake at midnight. He looked at Graham, not with anger, not with sarcasm, but as if sending an unspoken message. We saw, and we are assessing. Graham met his gaze and looked away. For the first time that afternoon, he was the one retreating. Jorge didn't move. He just stood there, long enough for everyone to understand that if something had gone wrong, it would be handled. But today he didn't need to do anything, because the woman standing there had already done enough, without a title, without authority, simply by refusing to shrink. Imani gave a small nod, not of fear or submission, but like closing a final statement. She turned, and as she walked away, the space around her seemed to expand with each step. No one spoke. No one ate. And Graham was no longer leading anyone at that table. He was just the man left sitting with a question that had just been answered with truth, too large to be swallowed down with a luxury meal. The feeling of being seen is not the same as being noticed. One is a desire, the other is an unavoidable truth. And Graham Beckett was caught precisely between the two. He didn't want to be seen like that. Exposed, diminished, defenseless. But the atmosphere inside the Marigold house had shifted. Everyone sitting near table 8 could feel it, even though they hadn't heard the full exchange. All they knew was that ever since the server named Imani placed that tray down and spoke her final line, the whole room had stilled. Forks moved more slowly. Conversations began to fade, and eyes, almost instinctively, started to turn toward the table no one had paid attention to before. Graham sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the edge of the table, where the sunlight from the window cast a long beam like a clock hand marking the hour of noon. Elodie said nothing either. She was thinking, but not about lunch or the afternoon meeting, but about the young woman who had walked away with a voice so calm it made people ashamed of their own emotions. Andrew, the young associate beside Graham, was still looking at his phone, but not to check emails. His screen was paused on a language translation app he once downloaded for a business trip to Tokyo. And in that moment, he asked himself, if Imani were the one presenting a strategy in the boardroom, instead of serving today, would anyone have dared interrupt her the way Graham just had? When Imani returned, no one spoke. No one signaled. No one waved her over the way they typically would for a server. She carried nothing but a fresh order slip from the kitchen printer. But what she brought wasn't a receipt. It was the continuation of a conversation that the other party still wasn't ready to admit they were losing. Graham looked up. This time he truly looked at her. Not the way people look at service workers, brief, glazed, loaded with silent judgment, but a long, slow gaze as if studying an object that had never existed in his world before. She didn't avoid that gaze. She didn't meet it with defiance either. She simply stood tall, hands behind her back, composed and steady, like someone who had seen far more eyes than this. "You worked as an interpreter in Germany?" Graham asked, his voice no longer firm. It sounded like it had been pulled from an old shelf in his mind that hadn't been dusted in years. Imani nodded. 6 months in Frankfurt. Elodie turned, speaking for the first time since the room had shifted. With which organization? It wasn't a polite question. It was sincere curiosity. Imani replied, REFI, Refugee Integration Foundation, an NGO that helps refugees from the Middle East and North Africa apply for asylum. Elodie nodded slowly. I've heard of them. Heavy work. Imani didn't deny it. There were days I only translated 3 sentences and felt like I'd worked a full week. Sometimes I had to pause mid-session because a Syrian mother sitting across from me would break down crying. She told me her 8-year-old son hadn't spoken a word since his father died in a camp. No one said anything. Graham lowered his head, his eyes now locked on his fingers, turning his ring, a habit he used whenever he felt off balance. Imani continued, her voice no longer that of a server recounting a resume. It was the voice of someone who had packed pain into syllables, carried it across languages, and lived with the echo long after. I once stood between a politician and a group of refugees. One side spoke flawless German, the other spoke broken Arabic, jumbled by trauma. I was the only bridge. If I chose the wrong word, they'd lose housing. If I paused for 2 seconds, they might be deported to a place that wouldn't exist tomorrow. Elodie gripped her water glass. Andrew looked up. Graham no longer turned his ring. Imani didn't stop. She knew that if she did, her words would be dismissed as biography. But if she finished, they would become a mirror that someone might be forced to look into. I once translated for an 8-year-old boy during a hearing. He didn't know if his mother was alive. I had to use the gentlest words possible to say that her case had been denied. He didn't cry. He just looked at me, and that look stayed with me. Graham looked up. His eyes were slightly red, but he said nothing. Imani held his gaze, not to accuse, not to shame, but because she knew he had never heard such stories told this way. Not preachy, not moralizing, not begging for pity. After that session, I sat by the window in my tiny apartment in Frankfurt for 3 hours without saying a word. I kept thinking about something my grandmother told me before I left Georgia for school. She said, "You're going somewhere where you'll be seen as a stranger, and one day someone will believe you are nothing. But don't ever let them decide who you are just because they aren't strong enough to see it." Elodie exhaled slowly. Andrew bowed his head. And Graham, the man who once made interns tremble in boardrooms, could only stare at the table. He said so quietly only she could hear it. I never knew, Imani replied. No sarcasm, no scorn, just a simple truth. Because no one ever made you need to know. No one tapped a knife against a glass. No one stood up. But the entire room had gone still, as if waiting for the next testimony from a witness they hadn't realized they needed. Imani remained standing, the window's light casting a halo along the edge of her hair. She wasn't asking for validation. She wasn't demanding agreement. She was simply telling her story, and that very act, unarmed, unhidden, was what made everyone take a second look. Because real mirrors, when placed correctly, don't need to reflect the whole picture, only the part someone has been avoiding. Graham looked up. His eyes were wet, not from tears, but because, for the first time, he no longer recognized himself in the portrait he used to believe was accurate. Imani turned away. Not because she'd won, but because there was nothing more that needed to be said. And for the first time since sitting down, Graham realized the chair he occupied was no longer big enough to hide what he had never learned to face. No one told them to be silent. No one tapped a knife against a glass to signal a pause. But the atmosphere inside the Marigold house, right after Imani stepped away from the center table, felt like a still lake disrupted by a single stone. Not loud, but rippling outward in every direction. And the largest ripple wasn't in the water, but in the hearts of those who once believed they were the center of that room. Graham Beckett didn't take his eyes off the space where Imani had just stood. Elodie sat quietly, her hands still resting on a water glass that hadn't been lifted since the start of the meal. Andrew had completely forgotten about the meeting that was drawing near. In a moment that seemed like nothing, all three of them felt something shift inside. Something they couldn't quite name, but they knew. It wasn't admiration. It was a conflict between discomfort, respect, and a deep, undeniable shame. The kind of shift no corporate marketing campaign had ever managed to create. And it wasn't just Graham's table. The surrounding tables had started to feel it too. The man dining with his wife at table 6, who had been buried in his phone and scarfing food quickly, looked up to follow Imani with his eyes. The young woman by the window, working on a thesis draft on her laptop, paused mid-sentence, then instinctively deleted the paragraph she'd just typed, as if it no longer felt honest after what she had witnessed. The entire room felt like someone had pressed a pause button, and the only one unaware of this shift was the person with the highest authority in the entire operation. Jorge, the floor manager on duty. Jorge emerged from behind the bar with a freshly made latte for a regular VIP guest. His eyes still bore the default urgency of someone in perpetual motion, completely unaware that the room had entered a semi-frozen state. It wasn't until he passed by and saw Graham Beckett, the chairman of the executive board, whose name everyone in the system was trained to remember, sitting there as if someone had peeled away an invisible mask, that Jorge hesitated. Is everything okay, sir? He asked, his tone still carrying the professional cadence polished over 5 corporate trainings. Graham didn't answer. Elodie simply looked at Jorge and gave a small nod, as if to say, it's better if you don't break this silence. Jorge furrowed his brow and moved on, still unaware of what had just taken place. And that, in itself, was the greatest distance between those who stood near Imani and those who truly heard her. In the back kitchen, Imani stood alone, still holding her order pad. Her hands were steady, but her heartbeat hadn't quite returned to normal. Not because of fear, but because she knew she had just done something beyond the expectations of anyone who wears a server's apron. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't cried. She hadn't slammed a table or shouted in protest. She had simply spoken, with a steady voice in unpainted truth. And that, more than anything else, forced everything around her to recalibrate its tone. In the stillness that now blanketed the entire restaurant, something was quietly being redefined. Power. Years ago, Imani had read a quote in an airport lounge in Nairobi. Silence is sometimes the loudest response to injustice. She no longer remembered the author, but in this moment, that sentence felt like it had just stepped off the page. The silence following her words was not an absence. It was the echo of a truth too rarely voiced in a space too polished to listen. Graham finally looked up. He turned to Elodie, not in search of agreement. She, he murmured, She's not like anyone I've ever met in the service industry. Elodie replied calmly, that's because she's never just been a server. Andrew added, I don't think I'll ever forget the story about the 8-year-old boy. The three looked at one another, but this time none of them felt the need to speak just to fill the silence. It was the silence itself that marked the real change. Outside, a new guest entered, an elderly man in a worn coat, carrying a thin book in one hand. He chose a table near the entrance. Imani approached, wearing her familiar smile and offering a polite greeting, neither excessive nor lacking courtesy. But something strange happened this time. The man looked up at her for a long moment before saying anything. You're the one who made the room stop breathing, aren't you? He asked, not as a joke. Imani paused slightly, then smiled softly. I'm just doing my job, sir. The man shook his head. Number, you're doing more than that. Then he opened the book, a collection of essays on linguistics, and read a short passage in Latin before asking, do you understand this? Imani answered instantly, translating the quote into fluent English. The man smiled and closed the book. You don't just understand language, you understand people. At that moment, Jorge passed by and frowned slightly when he noticed Imani standing longer than usual at table 11. But before he could say anything, the elderly guest turned to him. She's doing something most people in this restaurant don't know how to do, serving with dignity. Jorge froze. This time he had no reply but a mechanical nod. And as he turned away for the first time, a question echoed in his mind, one he had never thought to ask. Am I managing a place where people are truly seen for who they are? Imani returned to the payment station, where Margot, a young waitress often scolded by customers for being too slow, was struggling with a jammed receipt printer. Imani didn't say a word. She simply stepped in, tapped a few keys, adjusted the printer gently, and the bill slid out smoothly. Margot looked up, her eyes slightly teary. Thank you. I heard everything. Imani placed a hand gently on Margot's shoulder. I didn't do it to be heard. I did it because if no one says anything, people like us will always be seen as outsiders. And right then, Graham Beckett stood up. Not suddenly, not theatrically. He walked slowly toward Imani and stopped about a meter away. All eyes turned again. He spoke, not loudly. I misjudged you. Imani didn't smile. She simply nodded. And I wasn't the first, she replied. Graham sighed. Do you think you could teach me how to see people differently? Imani looked at him. No sarcasm. Just one quiet sentence. No one can teach that, but you can start by being quiet long enough to listen. No one was looking at the menu anymore. No one was ordering. No one was asking who was about to arrive. The atmosphere inside the restaurant had shifted after the moment that elderly guest stood up and gently touched Imani on the shoulder. A touch that wasn't forceful, wasn't staged, but caused the entire space to fall silent, as if time itself needed a few seconds to understand what had just happened. And in those seconds, every staff member's eyes turned toward the register. Not because someone had shouted, but because someone had said nothing and yet refused to lower her head. Jorge stood silently for a long while in his office, watching the security footage, then pressed temporarily save. He didn't delete it, but he didn't share it either. He wasn't sure if what he had just witnessed was a problem or an opportunity. All he knew was that, for the first time, he felt unsure. Elodie was different. She didn't leave. She stood near the entrance, hands still resting on her leather shoulder bag, watching as Imani walked to the back of the restaurant with a glass of water, as if what had just happened was a fleeting dream. But it wasn't. It was real, and clearer than any payroll report she had ever signed. At a nearby table, two guests whispered. One asked, "Did that girl just talk back?" The other replied, "No, she didn't talk back. She returned something that had been taken from her." No one fully understood the statement, but everyone felt its truth. Imani walked back to the kitchen. No one was there. The head chef had clocked out, and the prep cooks were checking inventory. She stood still for a few seconds, staring into the gently simmering pot of soup, the same one she stirred every evening, but never received praise for. Suddenly, a gentle hand touched her shoulder. It was Maria, the oldest waitress in the restaurant. She spoke softly, just enough for Imani to hear, and no one else. You just did something I've spent my whole life afraid to do. Imani didn't turn around. She simply replied, I didn't mean to teach anyone a lesson. I just couldn't stay silent anymore. Maria nodded, her eyes red, not from emotion, but from regret. If only in her time, someone had done the same. In the lounge, Elodie took out her phone. She didn't call legal, didn't call PR. She texted Graham, we just witnessed a truth that can't be rewritten with strategy. No period, no emoji. But Graham understood. Minutes later, he replied with a single word. Listen. Elodie knew it wasn't a command. It was a suggestion. To start by listening to the one who had frozen the entire restaurant without raising her voice. Jorge opened his office door and stepped out to the counter. Imani had returned to her station as if nothing had happened. A female guest placed her hand on the table, signaling to pay. Jorge glanced at the receipt, but before he could pick it up, the guest turned to Imani. Aren't you going to thank me? Imani paused slightly. Thank you. For what, ma'am? The woman smiled with an air of entitlement. For not calling the manager. You should know I was being very lenient. Imani said nothing. She didn't bow her head. She picked up a pen and wrote a single line on the receipt. Service should be measured by kindness, not endurance. Then she placed a $100 bill next to it. But Imani didn't rush to pick it up. She looked at the woman without smiling. I don't serve to be rewarded for courage, she said. The woman hesitated, then slowly pulled her hand back and nodded slightly, as if she understood something she'd never thought about before. Jorge had witnessed it all from afar, and he began to feel something he'd never tasted from any performance review or training program. The feeling of being outshined, not by skill, but by integrity. At the center table, Graham was jotting something into the small notebook he always carried. Elodie leaned slightly to peek, but didn't ask. When he closed the notebook and stood up, she asked, What will you do about this? Graham responded with another question. If this were my daughter, how would I want the world to treat her? And no one answered, because that question wasn't for the boardroom. It wasn't for the wealthy. It was for human beings, no matter what they wore, what they did, or where they came from. Imani was returning to the counter when Jorge called to her from behind. His tone no longer carried the usual sharp edge. Could you step into my office for a moment? He asked. She looked at him and nodded. The manager's office wasn't large. Just a desk, a computer, some papers, and a soft amber light. Jorge sat down, shuffled through unrelated files, stalling. I think I owe you an apology. Imani said nothing. Jorge continued. Not just for today, but for the many times I overlooked how you were treated, as if you didn't exist. Imani replied for the first time in this entire exchange. Listening isn't enough. If you don't change how this system works, next time there won't be someone calm enough to speak like I did. Jorge nodded slowly. I understand, and I'll speak with upper management. Maybe we should start by bringing you into the new training team. Imani looked at him. Not grateful, just honest. Don't add me just to polish the report. If you're serious, let me rewrite the opening section of the VIP guest service manual. And don't edit my words. That afternoon, the restaurant closed earlier than usual, officially for system maintenance. But the real reason was that the head of the corporation needed to meet urgently with the entire on-site staff. In that brief meeting, Graham stood before the team, recounted the event they had all witnessed, and declared, Today, someone in an apron taught us what took me 30 years in this business to begin understanding. Respect doesn't come from a title. It comes from how you look at someone when they're speaking. There was no applause, no tears. But in that moment, everyone felt something shift. And when they stepped out of that room, they no longer saw Imani as just a good server, but as someone who reminded them why they entered this industry in the first place, not to serve food, but to restore dignity. The phone didn't ring in Graham Beckett's office that morning. No surprise meetings, no urgent emails, only a single message from Elodie. You should review the Marigold Branch footage. Bar area, timestamp 1946. Nothing else. Graham opened the internal system, entered his special access code, and scrubbed to the exact time. He saw a young woman in an apron, speaking with an older customer, but what made him stop breathing wasn't the conversation. It was what happened next. The entire restaurant stilled, as if a sentence no one saw coming had just been spoken. He pressed pause, looked at Imani's face. Not angry, not shaken, just unyielding. Less than 10 minutes later, Elodie walked into his office carrying a printed sheet of customer feedback. The first line read, "I've never seen anyone in any luxury dining chain stand up for themselves without putting others down. That girl, Imani, made me rethink how I've treated people who've served me slowly." Graham read every word slowly. Each line seemed to carve itself into his mind. A man who once believed internal training and brand image refinement were enough to retain customers. But now he knew. No protocol could replace the presence of someone brave enough to speak without needing a microphone. Jorge was in a different state. He sat at his desk in the HR office of the branch, scrolling through last month's performance review list. Imani was ranked at the top, as always. But for the first time, he wasn't focused on scores. He was reading a handwritten note Graham had sent directly to him after the previous night's incident. A letter with no company logo, no official header, just one sentence. "It's time for character to lead, not those who've mastered the system." Jorge set the note down. It felt strange, as if the entire system was beginning to listen, without waiting for a PR disaster. Imani was unchanged. She still arrived on time, still wiped down the counter, still poured water for customers without being asked. But that day, after a customer handed her the bill, he also left a $100 bill and a handwritten note. "You don't need this money, but the world needs more people like you." Imani didn't keep it. She folded the bill, tucked it back into the receipt folder, and added a line. "I didn't stand up to be rewarded. I stood up because silence would have made me a stranger to myself." That receipt would later be scanned and quietly framed in Graham's office. Not for show, but as a reminder. An emergency meeting soon followed, an internal board meeting for Holt and Beckett. The agenda: reevaluating branch-level power structures. During the meeting, Elodie said, "What happened at Marigold wasn't an accident. It was a symptom. If an employee feels like there's no channel to speak, the first voice will always sound like an explosion." No one argued. Graham said little. He simply opened a draft email. The subject line: "The rewrite begins." The proposal: "We will form a field response task force, led by frontline employees, not supervisors. And my first invite goes to Imani Carter." At that very moment, Imani was washing glasses in the kitchen, unaware of any of it. But in a different conference room at corporate headquarters, a clip from the previous night was being replayed, for the 9th time that day, for a newly formed senior task force in charge of internal culture restructuring. They weren't looking at what Imani wore. They didn't ask what her credentials were. They kept rewinding the moment her eyes met the customers. Firm, unflinching, never condescending. And they knew. No training center could manufacture that. When she stepped outside, the sky had turned amber. That brief hour between day and night when the world itself seems unsure which direction it wants to go. A silver-gray car pulled up outside the restaurant. The driver wore a black shirt and said nothing, just gave a nod and opened the door. Imani recognized the small logo on his chest, an internal Holt and Beckett emblem. But what made her hesitate wasn't fear. It was the realization that she had once dreamed of this moment, but never thought it would come so soon. The car took her to a high-rise hotel where the 47th floor had been cleared out for a meeting that would never be recorded. When she stepped into the room, the first person she saw was Elodie. No blazer, no diamond watch, just a woman with eyes that now saw differently. Beside her sat a man Imani had never met, but recognized instantly from the way he carried himself. Graham Beckett. He stood, for the first time, and extended his hand. No greeting, just the gesture and silence. Imani sat down, back straight, not in defense, but as her grandmother once taught her, when you sit before someone who once underestimated you, don't shrug and don't raise your eyebrows. Just sit tall, because confidence never needs to shout. Graham opened his laptop and turned the screen toward her. "This is a draft of our complete training overhaul for Holt and Beckett. We want your input, not because you're impressive, but because you saw what we couldn't." Imani read the first few lines. "Communicate with empathy. Listen actively. Don't treat title as a measure of value." She looked up. "I'll rewrite it. Elodie blinked. You don't agree? She asked. Imani didn't smile. I don't want the system to just learn how to rephrase. I want it to learn how to say nothing and still let the person across from you feel seen. Neither of them objected. Graham simply nodded. Then you won't edit the copy. You'll write the original. When the meeting ended, Graham handed Imani an envelope. She opened it. Not a contract, not a plane ticket, but a handwritten letter. In blue ink, not printed, not flashy. It read, I didn't know who you were before today, but from now on, you're the person I'll reference in every leadership meeting as the reason listening is no longer a skill. It's an obligation. At the bottom, the signature didn't read Graham Beckett, CEO, just Graham. Imani stepped out of the hotel just as the last sunlight disappeared. No cameras, no one waiting to applaud. But her footsteps felt light, like she had finally stepped into a part of the world she once thought had no place for her. A place where words weren't dismissed just because the speaker didn't wear the right shirt. And that place had just been opened by a call no one ever thought would come. Among everyone present in the restaurant that night, there was only one person who said nothing, wrote nothing, didn't utter a single word of defense, but he saw everything and remembered every detail, not to judge, but to wait for the right moment. He wasn't listed on the official staff rota. He didn't appear on the internal organization chart. No email, no LinkedIn. Yet anyone who had worked long enough at Marigold knew he was the reason everything kept functioning when no one was paying attention. His name was Lionel, and he was the night janitor, the one who arrived after everyone had left and departed before anyone showed up. No one really knew where he lived. No one asked, because he never caused trouble, just quietly did his part. But that night, when Imani's glass slipped and shattered, and the entire dining room fell silent after her words, Lionel stood at the edge of the hallway, trash bag in hand, eyes unblinking, and knew what had just happened wasn't simply a clash between customer and server. It was the first fracture in a wall once thought unbreakable. Lionel was the kind of person the system easily overlooked. He wasn't included in routine trainings. No one asked for his thoughts on workplace culture. But Lionel observed, and he remembered. He remembered every newcomer, every manager who walked in and later walked out. He remembered who greeted him and who never made eye contact. Imani was the only one who had ever handed him a glass of water at the end of her shift and simply said, I don't know who keeps this place clean every morning, but if it's you, thank you. He didn't reply, just nodded. But today, as she stood there, alone, Lionel knew he had to do something he had never done before. Speak up. The next morning, Lionel wrote a handwritten letter. Not printed, not typed, written in slightly shaky but clear penmanship. He placed it on the morning manager's desk, right as everyone was busy checking inventory. No one noticed, until Jorge opened it. In the letter, Lionel didn't just recount what he had witnessed. He asked a question. If a server has to speak up to be heard, then who will speak up for those with no voice? At the end, he simply wrote, I don't have email, but if you want to talk, leave a note in the break room behind the kitchen. I'll read it. Jorge held the letter for a long time. He didn't know that just a few hours later, that letter would be scanned and sent directly to Graham Beckett. And Graham, unlike his usual composed self, called Elodie with a voice gone quiet. I think we've all had a Lionel in our lives, people we've stepped over. Now's the time to turn around. An emergency meeting was called, but not in the main conference room. It was held in Marigold's main kitchen. Every operations team member, from servers, janitors, and baristas to assistant cooks, was invited. No name tags, no titles, only one topic. Who carries the soul of this place? Elodie began by reading Lionel's letter verbatim. No edits, no summaries, no rewrites to fit internal strategy. She just read it, her voice for the first time, slightly trembling. When she finished, no one clapped. But no one looked away either. And the first to step forward was Imani. She didn't say much. She just looked around and said, I used to think I was alone when I spoke up. But I was wrong. Because if there are people like Mr. Lionel, and like anyone else who has kept this place going without being recognized, then I'm not alone. I was just the first to say it out loud. Lionel sat in the corner of the room, silent, eyes misty. Not from emotion, but because for the first time, His silence wasn't mistaken for indifference. After the meeting, Graham came to Marigold in person. No announcement, no bodyguards, no suit. Just a middle-aged man walking into a place he had never seen up close, but had influenced from afar for far too long. When he met Lionel, he extended his hand, not for a handshake, but to invite him to sit. I want to invite you to serve as an advisor for our new program, Voices Unseen. It's for employees who've never appeared on a PowerPoint slide, but have preserved everything good that no KPI could ever measure. Lionel looked at him for a moment, then spoke slowly. I don't need a title. I just need to know that from now on, when someone walks in with nothing but a good heart, they won't be overlooked. Graham nodded. And I need you to remind me of that when I forget. That night, Lionel left Marigold later than usual. But for the first time, someone waited for him in the parking lot, not to ask about the trash, but to say thank you. And he knew that silent moment, when he had just stood there saying nothing, was enough to create a ripple that the entire system would hear. The next morning, in the internal newsletter distributed company-wide, there was a small but powerful change. Under quote of the week, it wasn't a line from the CEO, nor a polished phrase from a famous speaker. It was a sentence pulled from Lionel's handwritten letter. Silence isn't always complicity. Sometimes it's a greeting waiting for the right person to hear it. No one knew who wrote it, except those at Marigold, and they began printing it out, posting it on bulletin boards, sticking it behind kitchen doors, and even engraving it on the underside of a few serving trays. That weekend, when Graham stepped onto the stage at the annual shareholder conference, he didn't begin with numbers or growth charts. He opened with the story of Lionel, a man not on payroll records, never invited to an award ceremony, but who taught the entire organization a lesson no MBA could. The room fell silent, and when he ended with the line, "If we only listen to the loudest voices, we'll miss the most important ones," the entire hall rose to their feet, not for the speech, but because they had just remembered someone they had once forgotten. Imani watched the speech on her phone. She didn't share it, didn't comment. She just sent Lionel a message. "I heard you." Lionel didn't reply. But the next morning when Imani arrived at the restaurant, she found a table rag neatly folded, with a handwritten note in pen. From now on, every quiet act will have someone who sees it. And that was enough. On a quiet Sunday evening, as the restaurant was closing earlier than usual for equipment maintenance, Imani packed up the last spaghetti dish of the night for a special customer, not because he was a VIP, but because Lionel had requested it that morning. He didn't explain why, just said, "Add a bit more cilantro and keep the cheese on the side." No one asked further. Everyone had grown used to his quiet demeanor, but this time Imani slipped a small note into the paper bag. "I still remember the first day we met. You were the first person who didn't judge me by my apron. Thank you for not staying silent." Lionel carried the bag of spaghetti to a small attic room above an old warehouse, a place he rented monthly that no one at Marigold even knew about. No TV, no internet, just a worn bookshelf and a dusty radio sitting on a table. He sat down, pulled off his worn-out shoes, opened the container, and looked at the pasta twirled neatly, like a circle of kindness someone had folded just for him. The little note fell from the bag. Lionel picked it up and read Imani's words slowly. Then he smiled. It was the first full smile he'd had since leaving his former office job. He began to write again. But this time, it wasn't a feedback letter or a warning memo. It was a draft. Not for the board, not for the shareholders, but for people like him, those with no official voice on the organizational chart, yet holding on to the most human parts of the workplace. In that handwritten draft, Lionel outlined a system called Circles of Trust, where every temporary employee, regardless of title or seniority, would be invited to share a story or an idea. Each month, one person would be randomly selected to ask a question that everyone in the group would answer, not with theory, but with lived experience. He mailed the draft to Graham Beckett, not via email, no attachments, just old-fashioned paper. 5 days later, Lionel received a handwritten reply from Graham. It contained only one sentence. "I never thought a plate of pasta could change a system, but maybe that's exactly what the system's been missing." And so the idea began to spread. From a dusty attic room, the draft traveled to every branch, translated into multiple languages, printed and pinned in employee break rooms, and eventually embedded into internal training modules. Lionel carefully folded the original after making numerous copies for the branches. He wasn't thinking about policy or procedures. He was thinking about real people. He thought of Marla, the assistant chef who was unfairly reassigned after demanding bigger meal portions for night shift workers. He thought of Elias, the hearing-impaired bartender who smiled constantly, yet was never once asked if the workplace could adapt better for him. And he thought of Imani, the girl who dared to ask a question in a place where silence often meant job security. The following Monday morning, when department heads were called to headquarters for Phase 1 of Circles of Trust, many were surprised. No consultants, no PowerPoint, just a round table, a small hourglass, and a whiteboard with a handwritten message. The one who speaks most doesn't always understand best. They were invited to sit. No hierarchy, no moderator. Just listening. And as each person shared about someone who once helped them, a person the system had never acknowledged, not one person left the room untouched. Lionel's story, born from a simple spaghetti dinner, was no longer a personal anecdote. It had become a milestone, quiet yet enduring, marking the shift of a system that once ran on forgetfulness. And when Graham was asked in an interview whether he felt ashamed that many of the changes didn't originate from the leadership board, he simply replied, "I'm not ashamed, I'm grateful, because the ones we used to think had no voice turned out to be the ones brave enough to say what needed to be heard." 1 year later, during the company's annual gala, when the Impact Maker of the Year award was announced, the name called was not a CEO, not a founder, not an investor. It was Lionel, the janitor who once didn't even have a nameplate. And when he stepped up in a clean shirt and under the bright stage lights, everyone rose and applauded. Not just because he changed workplace culture, but because he was proof of something the entire service industry had forgotten. Kindness doesn't need a microphone to echo. Imani stood at the back of the hall. She didn't step forward, didn't appear on stage, but she knew everything began the night she packed that spaghetti and left a note. She hadn't expected it to create such a shift, but now she understood. One small act, if honest enough, can do what orders cannot. In her hand was a paper napkin, the kind they used at Marigold, on which she had written in purple ink, "No one is forgotten if someone chooses to remember." And she believed from now on many would choose to remember. When a story seems to have ended, there are those who continue to live with it, not as a scar, but as a reason to stand taller each day. She Never Shrinks is not a final chapter. It is a living declaration of how a young woman, once called too fragile, too emotional, too reckless, became a new standard for how the world should treat courage. Imani Langston never accepted a managerial title, never asked for recognition, never appeared in any internal media reports. But perhaps she made the most defining impact on the operational structure of a corporation that had never imagined a waitress could redefine the way they exist. On a Friday afternoon after closing hours, while many had already left Marigold for the weekend, Imani stayed behind to wipe down the kitchen counters, rearrange the spice jars in order. Lionel walked by, nodding gently. No need for thanks. Both understood. The things left unsaid are often the things that last longest. But that day someone came, a stranger wearing a white shirt, hesitant in posture. He asked, "Is this the place where the girl who came up with that circle works?" Imani didn't respond right away. She simply tilted her head, removed her gloves, and extended her hand. "Come sit down. Want some tea?" And perhaps that moment was when everything began to be rewritten. Not in the records, not on paper, but in how young people like Imani were perceived. No longer a waitress. No longer the girl who asked too many questions, but someone who redefined what it meant to be big enough to bring about change. Imani didn't walk into meeting rooms as a symbol. She walked in carrying a question and left behind a trail of people who began questioning themselves. Marigold branches started hosting quarterly Imani Hour sessions, where one random employee was asked, "If you could rewrite one thing about this place, where would you begin?" No slides, no attendance sheets, just circles, blank paper, and pens. When a branch in Vermont reported that during its first quarter hosting Imani Hour, turnover dropped nearly 40%, Graham Beckett stayed silent for the entirety of that week's executive meeting. At the end, he simply said, "I used to think we needed a triple-layered evaluation system to keep staff. Turns out, what makes people stay isn't the contract, it's the feeling of being heard." That sentence was later printed on internal use coffee mugs. Imani didn't know. She still worked her shifts, still came home late every night, still sent money back to her mom. One night, after closing a late shift, she returned to her locker to grab her wallet and found a small envelope tucked inside. Inside was a handwritten invitation. "We would like you to represent Marigold at the Voices of Work conference in Chicago." At first, Imani thought someone was playing a prank. But no, the plane ticket was real. They genuinely wanted to hear her speak. That night, she stood in front of the mirror at home, took off her apron, and touched her collarbone. For the first time in her life, she asked herself, "If I'm not a waitress, then who am I?" But instead of fear, she smiled. Because she knew, if that question had once made people underestimate her, then now it was the very reason they were inviting her to Chicago. At the conference, among hundreds of business representatives, researchers, and service industry leaders, Imani stepped onto the stage in simple shoes and a low ponytail. No LED screen, just a microphone, and an opening line: "I don't have a degree in management, but I know how to make someone feel like they're not invisible." The room went silent, as if every planned presentation suddenly became irrelevant. Because that voice didn't belong to someone trying to deliver a talk. It came from someone who had once lived inside the silence of a system and had chosen never to let anyone else fall into it again. At the end of her speech, there was no thunderous applause. Just one man stood up, a senior manager from a competing restaurant chain, and asked, "If we wanted to start over, what should we do first?" Imani looked at him for a long moment, then replied, "Start by asking the people who've been too afraid to speak." No one remembered every word Imani said that day, but many remembered one thing. Her presence was a reminder that some people don't need a microphone to be heard. They just need not to be interrupted. And if a system is brave enough to sit in silence and listen to them, that system will outlive even its best financial reports. 3 weeks after the Chicago conference, a short bulletin appeared across Marigold's internal network. "Starting next month, all branches will hold 1 hour of regular sharing. No hierarchy, no reporting required, only honest presence." Beneath that line was a small illustration, an apron hanging on a hook next to an unused microphone. That image later became the unofficial logo of a movement many came to call simply Imani Time. In a later interview, when asked why she declined multiple offers to become a regional manager, Imani smiled gently and replied, "Because if I sit up high, I won't be able to hear those who still have their heads down." That quote spread so widely it was printed on the back of Marigold's new menus, a small reminder for everyone: serve by listening. Imani didn't become a director, didn't become a full-time speaker, didn't write books on leadership. She still lived in her modest rental, still rode her bike to work each morning, and occasionally still asked new hires, "Does anything here feel off to you?" as a way to quietly begin change. One late afternoon at the year-end meeting at the Central Branch, a colleague asked her, "Did you ever think you'd become the main character in a story the whole company knows?" Imani shook her head. "I never wanted to be the main character. I just wanted to be the reason someone didn't give up." As the lights dimmed and people stood up to leave, Imani stayed behind to tidy up. On the table was a small note left by someone, unsigned with a single handwritten line: "Thank you for not shrinking when everything told you to be small." She folded the note, placed it in her pocket, and knew, whatever tomorrow brings, she would stand tall again. Not because she was stronger than anyone else, but because she had learned one thing. The person who never shrinks is the one who makes the world expand to make room for what's right. Do you know what I can't stop thinking about when it comes to Imani? It's not that she once spoke at a major conference. It's not the praise she received from top executives. It's that in a world that demands you shrink to fit a mold, she chose to stand tall. Not loudly, not by stepping over anyone, simply by refusing to shrink. And because of that, hundreds of others, those who were overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed as just a server, began to believe that their voices deserved to be heard too. If you've ever done the right thing without being noticed, help someone without being thanked, thought someone like you could never change anything, then Imani is living proof that you were wrong. A person brave enough not to shrink will force the system itself to reshape around the size of their heart. And if that made you feel something, anger, inspiration, or simply a bit more faith in human kindness today, then I hope you'll do one small but very real thing. Leave a comment below and share how this story made you feel. Send this video to someone who needs to hear it today, and hit subscribe, so together we can keep telling the stories the world needs, but too often overlooks. Because sometimes a single share, a single subscription, is your way of telling the world, I won't shrink, and I won't let what's right be forgotten.